That Jesus came was the good news to the poor. That the poor is in the foremost of Jesus' mind is expressed in Matthew by the placement at the head of the blessings. In Luke, we see it in Magnificat, Mary's song, and elsewhere. Though Jesus did say to the disciples that they would always have the poor with them, that statement did not minimize the fact that Jesus' presence in the world was the good news to the poor. This understanding is very important. Christians were always friends to the poor. The disciples and early Christians did not focus on wealth. The first Christian community in the book of Acts saw everyone donating what they had to the church. The church distributed all they had to those in need. Widows and orphans, the poor of the day, were looked after. One reason they chose Stephen as a deacon was to look after those Greek-speaking widows in need, as they complained that they were not being looked after like the Hebrew-speaking widows. Christian history is partly about how Christians cared for the poor around them. Roman Emperor Julian complained to his high priest Arsacius, "It is disgraceful that when no Jew ever had to beg, and the impious Galileans, or Christians, support not only their own poor, but ours as well. All men see that our people lack aid from us." Throughout history, there were many times when the church was the only place where the poor would find help. That is, the Christians always remembered that Jesus' presence in the world ought to be the good news to the poor. With social welfare policies in Canada and many countries around the world, the task of looking after the poor have been usurped by governments. Yet in their policies, so many people find exasperation and frustration. The bureaucracies are not serving the poor as intended. Rather, they are maintained to keep social order. Often, the poor are continually marginalized, blamed, and oppressed. Some politicians now insist that to help them, we ought to establish tougher rules or unleash tough love in an attempt to get them off their skid rows. Many of us agree. We often wonder what good our government handout is accomplishing when so much money only seems to keep them in perpetual poverty. The question for us in this very difficult economic, social, and political climate is, how can Christians bring Jesus' good news to the poor? How can we tell the poor or poor in spirit that the kingdom of God is theirs? To bring the good news, we need to change our views about the world. Up until now, we see God's creation as a place of resources we could exploit. The first ones who discovered the ways to extract these resources and find uses for were able to declare ownership and gain wealth through exploitations of things that were already in God's creation. For example, a nugget of gold in the ground belongs to the very first one who discovers it. In fact, in Ontario, you and I own our land up to a certain depth. If someone discovers precious metal or oil far below my house, those metals do not belong to me. The one who discovered it can claim it in order to get to it. That person will pay us access to it. This understanding of ownership needs to be changed. When Jesus declared that the kingdom of God belonged to the poor, Jesus was pointing out the whole creation belonged to the whole humanity for its own good. That is, the poor have stakes in everything that God created. It does not simply belong to an individual or a corporation who discovered it, but to the entire humanity. This is why the Magnificat speaks of the lowly being brought up and the powerful are humbled. The rich go away empty while the poor are filled. One way the early church lived this message was to minister to widows and orphans as well as the poor who were Romans, as Emperor Julian noted. Later, this good news was shown through those Christian monks who gave up their riches to live their lives in poverty. St. Francis epitomized this willingness to be part of the poor, begging for food rather than remaining rich. By living the life of beggars, St. Francis highlighted how God's kingdom belonged to the poor as equally as to others as well. If we like to take the attitude that the kingdom of God belongs to the poor and we have a share in it, we see the poor not as those who ought to be cast out and avoided. They become God's stewards with whom we work to find ways to be blessed by God's kingdom and all therein. They become integral in everything we do as we discover new ways to be enriched by what God created for our use. At the same time, we work for the best to enrich all lives that occupy God's kingdom. Only when the whole creation flourishes, we thrive and are blessed by God's gift of life. Our way of thinking on the ownership of God's kingdom has to change. How does this blessing become the good news to the poor? It blesses the poor because they are included and are given full participation in sharing the wealth and riches of God's kingdom. It tells them they have as much place at the table as the richest person on earth. They are not pushed out of the society and made invisible. They become part of life as equal owners of God's kingdom. This blessing empowers us to share with the poor without condition. It empowers the poor to strive and partake in being stewards of God's kingdom. In this way, we no longer see a group of homeless in a cemetery. We see co-workers who are to be encouraged to be good stewards of it. We approach them not as the ones who do not belong there. We relate to them as stewards with whom we work together in love to maintain God's kingdom.